Mike was losing his mind over the idea that his wife, Jessica, was cheating on him. Her behavior had shifted, and it didn't escape his notice. With all the time he had on his hands now, ever since he'd been laid off from his job as a manager 2 months ago, Mike found himself obsessing over every little thing she did. Jessica started coming home later and later every night. She'd be all smiles, texting someone, and the moment Mike stepped into the room, she put away her phone, acting all cold and distant. That sudden change in her expression felt like a punch to the gut every single time. Maybe she's been doing this for a while, and I just never saw it because I was too caught up in work, Mike thought, a sense of panic gnawing at him. Before he got laid off, his days were packed with work, deadlines, meetings, leaving him with little time to notice the little things. But now, with no job and no real prospects in sight, he had all the time in the world to scrutinize Jessica's every move. Those late nights, the secret of texting, it all screamed one thing to Mike. She was cheating. One evening, after she came home 2 hours late, Mike decided he couldn't stay quiet anymore. "Why are you home so late?" he asked, trying his hardest to keep his voice calm and indifferent, even though he was anything but. Jessica replied just as casually as always, not a care in the world. "We got slammed at work. Me and the team had to stay late to finish up some reports." Mike stared at the TV, but he wasn't watching a damn thing. His mind was racing, and the uneasy feeling in his gut was growing stronger by the second. A few days ago, he had only felt a flicker of doubt, but now it had grown into a full-blown alarm, ringing so loudly in his head that it drowned out everything else. A few days later, Mike ran into one of Jessica's co-workers at the grocery store in Westwood. They made small talk, and then the woman mentioned, offhandedly, that they had all left work at the same time that night. Mike's heart dropped. So, Jessica lied to me? She wasn't even at work? Questions raced through his mind, each one more painful than the last. How could this be? They'd been married for 25 years. They had gone through so much together. Raising their daughter Emily, sending her off to college, moving twice from Seattle to Los Angeles, even surviving the chaos of home renovations. You don't just throw all of that away for some other guy. A few days later, Mike decided he needed to know for sure. Jessica was on the couch, once again engrossed in her phone. "My phone's dead. Can I borrow yours to call Emily?" he asked, trying to sound as casual as possible. But Jessica didn't even hesitate. She quickly shoved her phone into the pocket of her robe, clearly not wanting him to see it. That was the final straw for Mike. He couldn't ignore it anymore. She was definitely hiding something. Mike couldn't shake the feeling. His mind was racing, spinning with doubt and paranoia. Every little thing Jessica did seemed suspicious now. She'd been coming home late, hiding her phone, and those small, secret smiles she flashed at her screen. They were driving him insane. "It's late. Emily's probably asleep by now. Just charge your phone and call her in the morning," Jessica said, sounding calm. But there was something off in her tone. It felt tight, like she was holding back frustration. Mike tensed up. Not too long ago, she had no problem handing him her phone. Hell, she used to let him read her texts, joking that she had nothing to hide. But now? Now she guarded that phone like it was her lifeline. Back then, it was so different, Mike thought bitterly. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This was his moment. He had to ask. He had to know. Maybe if he caught her off guard, she'd crack, spill the truth. "Are you cheating on me?" Mike blurted out, his voice sharper than he intended, but he didn't care. He needed an answer, and he needed it now. Jessica froze, her expression shifting to one of pure shock. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, Mike wondered if she was genuinely offended, or if she was just playing the part of the innocent wife. He couldn't tell anymore. "Have you lost your mind?" "Of course not," she snapped back, looking at him like he'd grown a second head. "What on earth makes you think that?" Mike shot up from the couch, his heart pounding in his chest. He was done playing it cool. "Reasons? Oh, I've got plenty of reasons. You hide your phone from me, you lied about staying late at work, and don't even get me started on Linda. She told me you both left at the same time." Jessica crossed her arms, her face unreadable. But she wasn't flustered. If anything, she seemed annoyed, like she couldn't believe they were having this conversation. "I'm not giving you my phone because it has work stuff on it. We've got stricter security measures now, and I'm not risking my job," she shot back, cool and collected. "And yeah, I left with Linda, but we just want to grab something to eat. I went back to the office after. What's the big deal?" Mike hesitated. For a second, her explanation almost sounded reasonable, but something about the way she said it felt rehearsed. Was she telling the truth, or was she just that good at lying? "You're being ridiculous," she continued, her voice rising with frustration. "I'm working my ass off to keep our income steady, and you have the nerve to accuse me of cheating? I thought you knew me better than that. You know what? I'm sleeping on the couch tonight." With that, she stormed out, leaving Mike standing there, drowning in guilt. She wasn't one for drama, and in all their years together, this was as close as they'd ever come to a serious argument. Sleeping apart was a big deal, and it meant he'd really hurt her this time. Mike tossed and turned all night, the empty bed feeling colder than ever. Maybe he had overreacted. Maybe he was just putting two and two together and coming up with five. Coincidences, he told himself. It's just a bunch of coincidences. It doesn't mean anything. The next morning, he swallowed his pride and apologized. When Jessica came into the kitchen, he walked up to her, guilt written all over his face. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I shouldn't have doubted you." She smiled, soft and forgiving, and kissed him on the cheek. Peace seemed to settle over the house again. But as Mike turned to pour himself some coffee, he noticed something that made his stomach drop all over again. Jessica quickly placed her phone face down on the table, and her expression, too innocent, too casual, made his doubts resurface in full force. Mike used to laugh at guys who went to ridiculous lengths to spy on their wives. "Man, you gotta be real insecure and messed up to go stalking your own wife like that," he'd say, shaking his head. Jessica would always agree, nodding along. They never understood how people could get so hung up on their partners. They always thought their relationship was different, solid, built on trust. Mike couldn't even imagine being one of those paranoid husbands. But life has a funny way of turning tables. Now, he was that guy. He couldn't stop thinking about it. His mind was a storm of doubts and suspicions, and every little thing Jessica did just made it worse. How did he get here? How did he let himself fall into this pit of paranoia? The answer was right there. It all started with her phone. Mike tried to casually grab Jessica's phone a couple of times, like he used to, checking the time, looking something up. But now she had a password on it. That was the first red flag. He used to know her password, just like she knew his. They shared everything, but now there was this wall of secrecy between them. It gnawed at him, stirring something deep inside, something he couldn't shake. Hating himself for what he was about to do, Mike decided to follow her. Yeah, he was that guy now, the guy he used to mock. But he told himself this was the last time. He had to know, one way or another. If he found nothing suspicious, he could let it go. He could move on. So, that's how he ended up sitting in his car one gloomy evening, parked outside her office in Santa Monica, eyes glued to the entrance, waiting for her to come out. And when she finally did, his heart sank. There she was, stepping out of the building, dressed to kill in her best dress, her makeup flawless, her hair perfectly done. She looked stunning. Mike's heart ached seeing her like that. She was so beautiful, but it wasn't for him. No, she wasn't looking like that for him. His stomach twisted in knots as he realized this wasn't just some casual evening out with friends or coworkers. No, this was something more. This was date night level. He nearly choked when he saw where she was headed. She was walking straight toward that restaurant, the one they used to go to for dates back in the day. The place with the soft lighting, the live music, the cozy atmosphere that always made the evening feel special. It was their spot. And now, she was going there. But not with him. His brain went into overdrive. Everything seemed to blur around him as he watched her walk through the doors of the restaurant. He couldn't believe it. It felt like his worst fears were coming true right before his eyes. Was she really doing this to him? But he couldn't turn away. He needed to see how this played out. His knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel, but he forced himself to stay put and watch. Jessica walked inside, heading toward a table where a few people were already seated. Mike's eyes scanned the group, and then he saw her, their neighbor, Sarah, sitting there like it was no big deal. What the hell? Sarah? What was she doing here? Was she in on this? Was she covering for Jessica's little secret life? Mike's blood was boiling. He was almost sure now Jessica was cheating. There were barely any doubts left in his mind. Now, all he had to do was find a way to catch her in the act, to finally get the truth out in the open. Jessica came home late again, just like she had been doing lately. There was that usual happy vibe about her, like she just had the best day ever. She leaned in, wrapped her arms around Mike, kissed him on the cheek, then playfully tugged at his hand, trying to lead him to the bedroom. But Mike wasn't feeling it. He gave her some half-hearted excuse, saying he was tired, and forced a smile, though inside, he was boiling. She just jumped from one guy straight to another, he thought bitterly. The faint smell of a cologne he didn't recognize clung to her, barely noticeable, but enough to set him on edge. Mike knew better than to ask her any more questions. He'd been down that road before. Every time he tried, Jessica had an answer ready, something about a work party or an important business meeting. She was smooth with her stories, always making them sound believable. Nah, he told himself. If I want to find out the truth, it ain't gonna come from her. No, the truth would come from someone else. Someone who knew Jessica well, someone who might just slip up and let something important slide. And that someone was Sarah, their neighbor. Out of all of Jessica's friends, Sarah was the one Mike respected the most. She was straightforward, honest, at least that's what he thought. Plus, Mike had this feeling Sarah liked him, maybe a little too much. He smirked to himself, recalling that awkward moment from a few years back. There was one night, after a few too many drinks at a party, when things got a little close between them, but he shook it off. That wasn't important now. What mattered was that Sarah might be his key to the truth. So, Mike called her up. To his surprise, Sarah agreed to meet almost immediately, her voice carrying a bit too much excitement for his liking. But he ignored that. They met at a small cafe just a few blocks from his house. Mike was nervous, way more than he wanted to admit. He stalled the whole conversation, talking about the weather, random neighborhood stuff, anything to avoid diving into the real reason he asked her to meet. But after about 10 minutes of small talk, he couldn't take it anymore. His nerves were fraying, and before he could stop himself, he blurted it out. I saw you with Jessica the other night at that restaurant. What was going on? Sarah flinched, her eyes darting away from his. There was this awkward pause as she fumbled for words. Her face went pale, and when she finally spoke, her answer was vague as hell. We were just meeting someone. Mike wasn't having it. His heart was racing, and he pushed harder. A meeting who? Come on, Sarah. You don't have to tell me, but I need to know. He let out a heavy sigh, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him. Finally, he admitted the truth that had been gnawing at him. All right, here's the deal. I think Jessica's cheating on me. I know it sounds crazy, but I can't shake the feeling. I need to know. He tried to laugh it off, but his laugh came out strained. His weak smile froze when Sarah, avoiding eye contact, quietly muttered, Yeah, you're right. Jessica's been seeing Brian. That name. Mike knew it all too well. Brian. The moment Sarah said it, it hit Mike like a punch to the gut. Of course, Brian. He'd been Jessica's college buddy, back in the day, head over heels in love with her. Mike remembered him, the smooth, handsome guy who had always seemed a little too interested in his wife. At the beginning of their marriage, Mike had worried that Brian might try to swoop in and steal Jessica away. He was good-looking, successful, and had a confidence that always made Mike feel just a bit insecure, though he'd never admit it out loud. He could still hear Jessica's voice, so calm and sure, as she brushed off his concerns. Nothing's ever gonna happen between me and Brian, Mike. He's like a brother to me, okay? You've got nothing to worry about. Mike had believed her. Why wouldn't he? They'd always been honest with each other. That's how their relationship worked. Or so he thought. But now, sitting across from Sarah, hearing that same name, Brian, it felt like every bit of trust he'd had was crumbling away. Should have never trusted him, Mike thought bitterly. Turns out those feelings never went away, even after all these years. Sarah, noticing how tense Mike had become, reached across the table and placed her warm hand over his. Her touch was soft, almost comforting, but Mike felt no relief. Her voice was gentle, almost too gentle, as she continued. I didn't want to be the one to tell you. I know it hurts, and I never wanted you to go through this. But since you've already figured it out, there's no point in keeping quiet anymore. Jessica told me she's tired, Mike. She feels like she doesn't see the man she married anymore. You've been out of work for a while now, and it's weighing on her. Meanwhile, Brian's been doing great, expanding his business, just opened a new branch. Oh, and he's divorced now. It's been a few weeks since they started seeing each other. She's been dragging me along to these meetups to make it seem like it's not a date, like it's all innocent. Mike felt the anger bubbling up inside him, hot and bitter, choking his throat. And you're just happy to play along? What? You like holding the damn candle for them. His voice was sharp, each word cutting like a knife. Sarah sighed, looking almost guilty, but her tone was still calm. I thought if I stayed close, I could talk some sense into her. Make her realize what she's throwing away. But, Mike, I'm not sure it'll work. The way she looks at him, I think she's too deep in this mess. Sarah squeezed his hand tighter, her voice dropping to a low, sultry tone. I feel for you, Mike. Really, I do. Just know, I'm here for you. Whatever you need. A sharp jolt of déjà vu hit Mike. This wasn't the first time he'd heard those words. He remembered, years ago, when he and Jessica had a huge fight. Sarah had comforted him then too, said almost the exact same thing. And then, she kissed him. It had been unexpected, out of nowhere, and Mike had pulled back, stunned. "You've got the wrong idea," he told her softly back then. "I love Jessica, and I'm not the kind of guy who cheats." Sitting here now, the memory stung. Maybe I should have cheated, Mike thought bitterly. Hell, I'm the one walking around with horns now. But even as the thought crossed his mind, Mike knew he couldn't do it. That wasn't who he was. He'd never stooped that low. But calling out Jessica for what she'd done? Yeah, that he could do. And he would. His mind was made up. Mike had been sitting in the living room, his nerves on edge, his heart pounding hard in his chest. Thoughts were swirling in his head, each one angrier than the last. The second Jessica walked through the door, he jumped up, his voice sharp and full of accusations. "You really think I don't see what's going on? You think you can just play me like a fool?" His voice shook with anger, his eyes burning with suspicion and pain. Jessica barely had time to take off her coat before she froze in her tracks, staring at him wide-eyed. For a split second, she looked confused, and then she recoiled, as if he had hit her with something physical, not just words. Her face changed from shock to outrage. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "What the hell, Mike? What are you even talking about? Cheating? This is insane. Brian and I are just friends, that's it," she said, her voice trembling with frustration, trying to defend herself, but knowing deep down he wasn't going to listen. "Friends? Yeah, right," Mike scoffed, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "At least you admitted you've been meeting up. That's one lie down. Who knows how many more you've been feeding me?" Jessica clenched her fists, her breath quickening. She took a step toward him, her face flushed with anger. "Do you even hear yourself? Do you really believe I cheat on you? If anyone's lying, it's Sarah. She's been making stuff up, trying to stir trouble like she always does. I swear to God, Mike, on anything, on our daughter's life, I haven't cheated on you. Never." Her voice broke, and tears welled up in her eyes, but she fought to hold them back. Mike rolled his eyes, his lips curling into a bitter, mocking smile. "Don't bring Becky into this. Have you got any decency left? Leave her out of your mess," he said coldly, distancing himself emotionally as if trying to detach from everything that still connected them. He took a step back, looking her up and down like she was a stranger, someone he didn't even know anymore. "I thought you were different. I thought you were special, Jess. Not like everyone else. But the second we hit a rough patch, you run straight to the next guy who's got a better job or more status, huh?" His voice was tight, like each word was hard for him to say, but his anger and hurt wouldn't let him stop. Jessica stepped forward, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, but she stood her ground, refusing to break. "You're not even gonna let me explain, are you? You've already made up your mind that I'm lying, that I'm everything you've convinced yourself I am. You're not even trying to understand." Her voice softened, filled with pain and disbelief, almost a whisper now. Mike shook his head, his face set in cold, hard lines. "What? So you can feed me more lies?" "No, Jess. I'm done. Just pack your stuff and go. I don't want any more of this." Jessica stood there, stunned, as if she couldn't believe the words coming out of his mouth. She stared at him like she was seeing a stranger, her breath shaky, and tears finally spilled down her cheeks. She wiped them away quickly and met his gaze one last time, her voice trembling but resolute. "Fine, Mike. I'll leave. But just know this, you are the one who destroyed our family, not me." The next couple of days after Jessica left felt like a blur to Mike. The house, once filled with her presence, now seemed eerily empty, as if life itself had drained out with her last step out the door. Mike spent most of his time sunk into his chair, staring into the void. The silence in the house echoed, hitting him like a heavy, painful beat in his chest. Sarah had stopped by a few times, bringing over homemade meals, as if trying to fill the emptiness left behind by Jessica. But each time, Mike remained distant, refusing to let her inside. Her efforts to comfort him only irritated him. He didn't want to be consoled, didn't want her around. Yet, as time passed, his mind started to race with doubts. Maybe I overreacted, Mike thought in the dead quiet of the house. Maybe I should have listened to her, really figured things out. And even if they did meet up, does it really matter? We've got so much more than she could ever have with Brian. These thoughts gnawed at him, creeping into his mind more frequently. He felt torn, oscillating between anger and regret, waking up each day with a growing weight pressing down on him, as if he had missed something crucial. Then one evening, when the familiar sound of a key scraping in the door broke the silence, Mike felt his heart jolt in his chest. Adrenaline surged through him. Could it be? Had Jessica come back? Was she ready to talk? He rushed toward the hallway, hope flaring inside him. But as the door opened, the figure standing there wasn't Jessica. It was their daughter, Becky. She stormed into the apartment, her face flushed with anger, her brows furrowed, and her hands defiantly planted on her hips. In that moment, Mike couldn't help but marvel at how much she resembled Jessica. The likeness was uncanny, and it hit him like a wave. She's her mother's daughter, through and through, he thought. But his fleeting sense of warmth was immediately shattered by Becky's outburst. "What the hell did you do?" Becky's voice rang out, her words sharp with fury. "Mom came to us in tears, Dad. She hasn't stopped crying since she got here. What the hell made you think she was cheating? She practically worships the ground you walk on." Mike stepped back, taken aback by the force of her words. He hadn't expected this. Her accusation hit him like a slap, and he could feel himself retreating under the weight of it. I was told," he stammered, his voice weak. "An eyewitness told me. They knew for sure she was cheating." Becky narrowed her eyes, suspicion flashing across her face. "Who, exactly?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "It wasn't Sarah, was it?" Mike's silence was all the answer she needed. She let out a scoffing laugh, disbelief etched into her features. "That woman's had a thing for you for ages." Becky snapped. "It'd be nothing for her to lie and mess with your head. And you believed her? Over Mom? The woman you've been with for over 20 years? Mike, caught off guard, stood there in silence. He couldn't come up with a solid reason to defend himself. "Why would she lie?" he muttered. But even as he said it, he knew how hollow it sounded. "Guess we're about to find out," Becky shot back. She stormed out of the apartment, with Mike scrambling to follow. He watched, stunned, as his daughter marched straight to Sarah's door and began pounding on it with her fists. When Sarah opened up, Becky wasted no time, forcing her way inside. "What the hell did you say to my dad?" Becky demanded, her words a verbal assault. "How dare you mess with my parents' marriage and slander my mother? You need to get over the fact that your mom betrayed your family," Sarah sneered, throwing out her words like a dagger. The coldness in her voice stung more than Mike had expected. He tried to step in, maybe put an end to the mess unraveling in front of him, but it was like he was invisible. Becky and Sarah were so caught up in their screaming match that Mike's presence didn't matter. Their voices got louder and more frantic, each trying to outshout the other, like a storm brewing with no sign of calming down. "Your parents should have split a long time ago," Sarah shouted, her eyes blazing with a mix of anger and something else, something darker. The venom in her voice made Mike flinch. This was getting too personal, too real. "Mike should have married me, not your mom." Sarah spat out with bitter contempt. "I was the one who met him first. She stole him from me. All I did was give them a little nudge toward the inevitable." Becky froze, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. Her mind seemed to be racing, trying to process this avalanche of revelations. "Marry you?" Mike finally found his voice, his tone sharp with disbelief. "I never even liked you." Sarah turned to him, her eyes wide and shimmering with unshed tears, clinging to some hope that maybe, just maybe, he was lying, that he still felt something. "Why are you lying?" Sarah's voice wavered, and she looked at him with desperation. "You felt it too, back then, didn't you? The spark between us? I saw it in your eyes. I know you wanted to leave Jessica. You just didn't because Becky was still a kid. But she's grown now. There's nothing holding you and Jessica together anymore. I was just trying to help you see the truth, to give you that push you couldn't make yourself." Mike stood there, stunned, his mind racing to piece together what he'd just heard. His heart pounded in his chest, and suddenly, everything started to click into place. But the picture forming was one he wished he hadn't seen. "What do you mean by push?" he asked, his voice tight with barely contained anger, though part of him dreaded the answer. Sarah flushed, but instead of backing down, she stood taller, defiant. "Yeah, I lied about Jessica, but it was for us. For you," she said, her voice rising defensively. "Don't you see? She's all over Brian. They've been way too close since he got divorced. I just helped you see what's been right in front of you." The words hit Mike like a punch in the gut. He stared at her, realization dawning with every second. His suspicions, the sleepless nights, the storm of emotions. All of it had been a lie. You lied to me? Mike's voice was low, but it trembled with fury. All of this, everything, was fake? Sarah reached out a hand, tears now fully streaming down her face, but Mike jerked away like she was poison. You almost destroyed my marriage with your sick fantasies, he shouted, barely keeping himself in check. Don't you dare touch me. Even the scent of her perfume was now unbearable. It made his stomach churn. Without another word, Mike bolted for the door. He couldn't stand to be in the same room with her anymore. Becky silently followed him out, slamming the door behind them. When they finally got home, Mike collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. His mind was spinning, and a heavy wave of guilt settled over him. I've been such an idiot, he whispered, his voice cracking with regret. Becky, standing nearby, let out a sigh of relief but couldn't help giving him a side eye. Took you long enough to figure that out, she said with a smirk. You messed up 3 times. Thinking Mom was cheating on you, believing that lying woman, and not even letting Mom explain. Mike exhaled deeply, her words sinking in. Becky was right. He had screwed everything up. But if Mom wasn't cheating, Mike said suddenly, what was up with her meeting that guy all the time? Becky crossed her arms, her expression serious. You would have known if you just listened, she shot back. Now, you can either spend the rest of your life wondering, or you can go to her, apologize, and get the truth. Make the right choice, because you won't get another chance. Mike didn't hesitate this time. I'll go to her, he said, determination in his voice. Mike couldn't stop his mind from racing. His thoughts were a tangled mess, a chaotic whirlwind of regret and confusion. He knew he'd let things spiral out of control with Jessica, all because of him. The guilt gnawed at him relentlessly, making him replay every word, every mistake. How had he let Sarah's lies blind him like that? I can't believe I fell for her nonsense, he muttered to himself for the 100th time. But no amount of self-reflection could change the past. One thing was clear. He had to fix things with Jessica, somehow. After hours of pacing and thinking, Mike decided to make a move. He knew that simple apologies wouldn't cut it. He had to show her, in a tangible way, that he was truly sorry. He remembered Jessica's favorite flowers, white roses. A big bouquet seemed like the right first step. Standing at the front door, holding the bouquet, Mike's heart pounded in his chest. His nerves were on edge like never before. It felt like he was about to do something way more serious than just apologize. When Jessica opened the door, her expression was hard to read, and Mike knew he had to give it everything he had. I've been a complete idiot, he started, his voice full of guilt, as he handed her the roses. He felt like the flowers were almost too small a gesture for the mess he'd caused. I don't even know why I believed Sarah. Maybe it was the months of being out of work, losing confidence in myself. I mean, what kind of woman wants to stick around a guy who's basically a deadbeat, with no job, no future? Jessica looked at him, her face serious at first, but then the corner of her mouth twitched into a small smile. You're not a deadbeat, Mike. You just had a rough patch, she said softly, her voice full of understanding. But I won't lie, your accusations really hurt. Do you even want to know why I was meeting with Brian? Mike's throat tightened. Part of him didn't want to hear it, but he knew he had to. He gave a small nod, swallowing hard, waiting for the truth to hit him. Jessica paused, then took a deep breath and said, Brian's opening a new branch of his company, and he needs a director. You're perfect for the job. So I reconnected with him to try and get him to consider you. I wanted to surprise you. I know how much you've been missing work, and I believe you deserve better than just sitting around, doubting yourself. Mike stared at her in shock. All this time, she'd been looking out for him, and he'd been too caught up in his own insecurities to see it. His eyes welled up with tears, and he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. You did all that for me? I'm such a fool. Just then, Becky chimed in from the side, where she'd been quietly watching the whole scene unfold. You're both fools, to be honest, she said with a smirk. Let this be a lesson. Serious stuff like this needs to be talked about, not turned into some secret spy operation. Mike let out a laugh, though it was shaky and full of relief. She's right, he said, finally looking up at Jessica. We could have lost everything because we didn't talk. But I promise, after this, our relationship's only gonna get stronger. Once you forgive me completely, that is. Jessica smiled, warmth flooding her eyes. I've already forgiven you, she said quietly, but you've still got to earn the rest of it. And it's gonna take some time. I'll wait as long as it takes, Mike said seriously, squeezing her hand. Because you're my world.